John wants us to know and understand this. It's a real simple concept, but it is fundamental to our faith and to the faith of others. So 1 John chapter 2, verses 3 through 6. And by this we know that we have known him. Now, often people will have the question, how do I know I'm saved? How do I know I'm a Christian? So John thought it must have been a relevant or prevalent enough problem that John writes about it. How do I know it? How do I know, and how do you know that I know? And so John wants to cue us in. And by this we know that we have known him. How is it that I know? And he goes on. If we keep his commandments. Pretty simple. How do I know I'm a Christian? Christian, are you keeping God's commandments? Well, yes. Then you must know him. Because how can I keep the commandments of somebody I don't know? I can't. I can only know what he wants me to do because I know him. And then once I know him and I know what his commandment is, am I doing it? If I'm doing it, then he must be my master, because I'm not going to listen to someone else's master. I'm going to listen to my own. So, and we know that we know him if we keep his commandments. He who says, I have known him, and does not keep his commandments is a liar. Plain and simple. We look at folks out there who claim Christianity and we see no Christian conduct in them. I would doubt their Christianity. We look at the life of somebody and we begin to realize there are things in there that should not be in a Christian life. And so we could begin to call into question, for that person's comfort, their salvation. Get them to take a good close look. They're a liar, and the truth is not in them. Not only is he a liar, see, you could know the truth and lie about it. But he says, I'll tell you something even worse. Not only is this guy a liar, but he doesn't even have the truth in him. If the truth isn't in me, then who's missing? God is truth, right? And so if the truth isn't in me, then God's not in me. And if God's not in me, I'm not a Christian. Because Jesus promised part of the salvation process is that he would come in and take up his abode with me. I will abode with you and you will abide with me. If that didn't happen, then Christianity did not take place. So he's sharing with us some very fundamental facts, very simple logic, very simple reasoning to follow along with, but he thought it's important that we should ask ourselves these questions. But whosoever keeps his word, truly in this one the love of God is perfected. It's grown up. It's matured. It took root. Remember the story about the sower who went out to sow, and he started casting his seed, and some fell over here on the stony ground, didn't grow. Some fell over here, birds came up and ate it. Some fell over here, grew up quickly, but then withered away. Some grew up in the good soil, and it continued to flourish and brought forth 30 and 60 and 100-fold. That's where we're supposed to be, in that good soil. Because after all, isn't God the good soil in our story? Isn't the good soil God himself? And so if you land in God, if you're in him and he with you, then truth will be multiplied in us. So this is the ideas that he has put to us. We are perfected. By this we know that we are in him. And finally, verse 6. He who says he abides in him ought himself also to walk even as he walked. Well, you and I, those of us who claim Christianity, should be mirrors of Jesus. And when people see us, they should see him. And when people see him, they should say, you know what, I've seen a little bit of Terry in you. That's what he's bringing us to. So I've broken all of this down into two words, knowing and doing. So the very first word, you can see this is a rather complicated outline this morning, so you'll have to follow me closely. Knowing. Knowing. To know somebody. To really know someone. We know that we have known him. How? Well, first of all, we have to, I guess, consider what knowledge might be. It is not the mere study of somebody. For example, this morning I could tell you I know my father, my earthly dad. And you could say, how do you know? How do I know you know him? Well, I could give you his name. You say, well, I already know your dad's name. Therefore, I must know him too. Yeah, I can give you his birth date. Well, hey, my dad's birthday's out there probably on the internet. So a lot of folks who don't know my dad could know his name and his birth date. You could know all those, his social security number. I'm sure the dark web has hold, and even though he's been passed away now for all these years, I'm sure the dark web has all that information on him. You might know that he served in the Navy. You might even know what his rate and rank was while he was in the Navy. You may have known where he served. That's general knowledge. That's out there for anybody to find. But what you don't know about my dad are the stories that I know about my dad. The moments we shared, those aren't in any book. I haven't written it yet. And to my knowledge, my dad didn't write that book. So there are things that I could know about my dad, some moments that we shared together. For example, when I was a young child, I was rather rambunctious. So I remember, and you won't find this on the internet no matter how hard you search, when I think I was about 3 years old or so, I was in trouble for something. I think he made it up, because how could I possibly be in trouble for anything? But I know I was supposed to be getting a spanking. So I remember my dad grabbing me up, and he's holding me like this. My rear end is here, and my head's down over there. It's shortly after Christmas, and one thing you don't know is at Christmas, he gave me a little, all the kids got little cowboy cap and gun sets. A little plastic belt, a little holster, a little gun. And my dad's got me upside down. He's going to take the belt to me. So I quickly unholstered myself and grabbed my little belt. And Mom thought it was the funniest thing, and Dad couldn't whip me anymore, because Dad's getting ready to spank me like this, and I got my little belt out and hanging upside down. I'm whacking my dad. And Dad's like, look, Susie, isn't this cute? And Mom's thinking I should get beat real good because I'm doing that, but my dad couldn't. Now, you won't find that story anywhere. I know that story. My dad knows that story because it happened to us. My brothers and sisters might see it because they witnessed it from the hallway as we're walking down the hall there in our house up there in Watford City as my dad is getting ready to spank. I never got the spanking. See, I know my dad. I know the things that probably, even though I don't recall it at the moment, could probably figure out what I may or may not have done that got him going. I know once we got down the hallway that when we got into the playroom downstairs of the room we were going into, the den or whatever they called it back in those days, there was a train set. My dad loved trains. And so the train was all set up and it was going around the track, and we had a wonderful time that night. See, there are memories that I have because I know my dad. Things I could tell you about my dad that aren't recorded anywhere. Conversations that him and I had. Now, I can't tell you the conversations that him and John had, my older brother, or him and Charlie may have had, or him and Randy may have. I can only tell you the experiences that I had with my dad because I know him. And so the point that John was making to you and to me is this, that knowing Jesus, knowing God, isn't necessarily to study him. You could study my dad, like I was saying. You could find out his birth date, and you could find out this about him and that about him. Things that are general knowledge and things that are out there written about him. Anybody could do a study of anybody and know something, some external information about him. All of us, when we were kids in school, studied about George Washington. We all know, back in our day anyway, children don't know this anymore, but we knew that George Washington never told a lie. We all know the story of George Washington and the cherry tree. How that when his father said, "Who chopped down that cherry tree?" Old George said, "'Twas I." We all know those historical applications or those historical things about them. But that's all we really know about George. We don't know much more than that. I know he had a powdered wig. I know he dressed kind of funny for our day and time, but he fit in real comfortable when he was there. I know he was the father of America, and I know he was our general during. See, there are things that I could study and find out about George Washington. And there are things that I could study and find out about God. But studying somebody isn't knowing that person. You know about them. And John here is saying to us, we know him. Not I know about him. That's vastly different. To know about Jesus Christ is one thing. The world, the devil knows about Jesus. He knows about Jesus better than I do. But I know Jesus. There are those out there who are more scholarly than my son Michael, more scholarly than his dad will ever be. He knows about stuff, but when it comes to knowing Jesus, he doesn't know Jesus like I do. I don't know Jesus like he knows him. We have an intimate relationship with Christ, and we have that intimacy that nobody else shares. It's like that song, I Come to the Garden, right? And there's a phrase in there that we shared that moment that nobody else can share. Nobody knows that moments that I have shared with Jesus Christ when I have traveled this world. The things that him and I have done together, the things that I have witnessed him do through me, those are moments that no two have. And so what John is trying to say here is we know him, we know that we know him, but this is a deep, not head knowledge, but it's a deep emotional tie. It's not only a physical knowledge, but a deep emotional bond. It's really a bond. It's kind of like marriage where the two become one. He abides in me and I abide in him. And our shared experience together lets me know that I truly know him. He knows things about me that nobody else knows. And I have an experience with him that nobody else has experienced with me. Knowing that we know him. So first of all, it's more than just a study. I haven't just studied the life of Jesus Christ. I know Jesus Christ personally. I could tell you stuff about him, sure. I could tell you that he was born for most of us on Christmas. Whatever day he's born, it's Christmas. Right? Doesn't matter to me. I like December 25th. I like where it's located. But hey, if somebody came up and said, you know, it was really in June or July, probably July 22nd would be a good day for him to be born. I wouldn't care. It would still be Christmas Day. It would still be the day of Christ's birth. So whatever day, it don't matter to me. And so that may be something I don't know. But I know his love. I know in those deepest moments in my life, he was there. And I know he loves me because he came to me there, met me there. I can tell you about the time when I was praying. I was looking for my father. Hadn't seen my dad in years, in 1987. I was praying because I had trouble with, I don't have trouble with Jesus and I don't have trouble with the Holy Spirit, but I do sometimes have trouble with the Father. At least I did. Because you get your idea of the Father from your father, and my father took off and left me. And so it was always kind of a weakness in my Christianity was my relationship with the Father. The Son and the Holy Spirit, not a problem. But with the Father, I had a problem, and I knew it. After weeks and weeks of prayer, I got on my knees. I was all alone in my home. I got on my knees. I'm kneeling in our newly built den. I'm kneeling there at the edge of the couch, and I'm praying about that issue. I didn't know where in the world my dad was. But while I'm praying, I felt hands, and I thought my wife must have walked in because I could feel the hands on my shoulder. And suddenly in my heart, it came to me, you'll find him. You'll find him. And I looked up to see who was standing there, and no one was in the room. It was just me. And some years later, I found my dad. And we had a restored relationship when I found him. And my whole family, including my mom, who wanted to see him dead. Only way she wanted to see Dad was 6 feet under. But wow, what a miracle God did in my mother, in my brothers, in my family, when he restored Dad back to us. And he told me that while I was kneeling in prayer, and I felt his presence in a very real and positive way. Now, sometimes when you share things like this with people, it's hard for them to understand because they haven't had that experience. But see, that's an experience that I shared with God in my prayer closet. And it was very real to me. And the fact of its reality was the fact that sure as he had said, we found my father. And we would restore. I always told him, I said, I don't want to find my dad if I can't win him to Jesus. It'd be better for me to never see him again than to see him and know he's on his way to hell. And when I saw him, I watched him walk the aisle in our church. See, when God gives completely. See, that's something I know. It may have taken 30 years for me to find my dad, but in 30 years, there he was. Well, actually, it was a little bit more than 30. I think it was like 36 years or something. But there he was, walked back in, 32 years. From the time he left, I was 8 years old, 40 years old when I found him. 32 years of prayer. But wow, what an answer. What an answer. See, knowing God isn't just studying God. No more than knowing my dad was a study of my dad. See, I know my parents because I lived with them. I didn't know my mom because I studied her life and I read about her in a book. I know my mom because she abode with me and I with her. I know my mom. See, other kids may have known who my parents were, but they didn't know my parents. I know my parents. I know my brothers and sisters. I share stories with my brother John that no one else can share. Of course, if he shared the same story with you, I'm sure he'd change some of the facts. Like the time we almost drowned at Long Beach and who saved who. He always tries to edit that to make it his story when really it's mine. But there are moments, I could tell you stories about my big brother, but my brother Charlie could tell you different stories because him and John had a different relationship. And I wouldn't know anything about that part of it, those particular stories. Those were theirs. Your story with Jesus Christ may be different from mine because you share a different experience. But there are those commonalities. We both obey him, and that's our next subject we're coming up to. But we know not from study, but we know from living with. That's the point. I didn't study my dad. I didn't study my mother. I didn't study my brothers and sisters. I didn't study my wife and my kids. I know my wife and my kids because, hey, we've been together 42 years. I know a little bit about her. I could, I suppose, have somebody write a book about her, but they wouldn't know her the way I know. I would say, hey, there's pages missing out of this book. Her mom and dad could write a story about her, and they could write a story about her up until she was 18, 19 years old. They may even be able to write a story about her up until she was 20. And then after that, it's going to get a little bit sketchy because they weren't living with her anymore. My details about my wife would be much better than their details once we got married because she lived with me. And so I could tell you about this experience that her parents know nothing about. Their experiences were their experiences, and my experiences are my experiences. But what I know about my wife and what I love about my wife is what we have shared together. Not what I read in a book about her. Not what somebody told me about her. Because depending on who you talk to, they could have been a gossip and made the whole thing up. So knowing, and part of that knowing is living with. It comes from loving and living with, and that's the difference. Do you love God and do you live daily with him? Not just do you read about him. I read my Bible every day. I am constantly going through particularly the life of Jesus Christ every day. And that's a way for me to get close to him. But in our daily experience together, when I live and walk and follow his commandments. See, because that's the second part, really. We got to bring this one in. And it's doing. Whoever keeps my word. See, that's how you know you belong to someone. Like I said, go back to in my neighborhood. All the kids knew us. All the kids knew my mom and dad. If my dad was to holler out, every one of those boys was a son to someone, right? But if my dad walked out on the front porch and said, son, get in here and mow the backyard, how many kids from the neighborhood are going to come and mow the yard? Just one. Well, in my dad's case, 6 boys. I knew he was talking to me. I'm outside there, and if my dad said, get in here and mow the yard, Mom almost never used our names. 8 kids, it would take her 10 names to get to yours anyway. But you knew Mom was talking to you. You know who that gaze was at, and you got there and moved when she was telling you to move. And the same thing with Dad. When Dad called you to do something, you knew Dad was talking to you, even if he didn't use your name. You knew your dad, and you knew his communication style with you. And you knew that one was yours. And you got to moving when he said to move. Because you knew you had lived long enough with your dad to know the consequences of not obeying. And you didn't want to get those any too often, let me tell you. And so the same thing about God. Doing is a large part of the knowing. How do I know him? Because I keep his commandments. Any other dad in my neighborhood could have gone out there, just as my dad, and said, hey, son, come in here and mow my yard. I wouldn't go mow anybody else's yard. Why? Because I don't know them. Oh, I know about them. I know this is Mike's dad, and this one over here was David's dad, and this. I knew that about them, but it's not my dad. So I'm not going to go mow some strange guy's unless he's going to pay me. Now, my dad didn't pay us for mowing the yard. Some stranger would have to pay me. Why? Because he's not my dad. I know about their dads from stories they had told us, but I don't know their dads. I could study, I suppose, about their dads, but I don't know. See, my relationship with my dad wasn't a study. Mine was a living and loving relationship. And that living and loving required something of me. It required doing. If I never did anything that man told me to do, you would argue that perhaps that's because it's not his dad. When a father stood out there and called his sons in and I didn't go, what would you conclude from that? Oh, must not be Terry's dad. Some woman goes out on the porch and says, y'all come on in, and I don't move, you know something. That's probably not my mom. Because when my mom said, get in here, we were swift of foot and got in wherever she called us. So then you could sit there and say, either that's his mom or it's a woman that I should be afraid of too. And that's probably much closer with my mom. You should be afraid of her too. So this is the thing, is doing. See, whosoever keeps his word. That's how you know who you belong to. Because you keep their word. What they tell you to do, their commandment. When my mom said do this, you did it. My dad, you said do that, I did it. Why? Because that's mine. And you could look and say, that must be his parent because he's doing what they told him. So knowing brings obedience. Because I knew him, I was obedient. Look at what he says. Whosoever keeps his word, truly in this one the love of God is perfected. Truly that's his dad. Truly that's his Savior. Truly that's his Lord. Why? Because look, he does what God asks him to do. When God asks him to do it. The way God asks him to do it. That's how you know. You know that he's mine because you could see me being obedient to God. You could read your Bible and say, oh, that's why Terry does that. It's in the Bible right here. So he must be a believer in this book. So knowing brings obedience. We know it, and this is the important thing. See, because remember, John's talking about false teachers, right? False believers. We know it because we keep his commandments. See, that's where people might say, how do I know I'm a Christian? Well, do you do what God asks you to do? How do I know I love my parents? I know I love my parents because I did the things they told me to do when they told me to do it, the way they told me to do it. And often I would do it without, my mother worked long hours when we were kids. And I remember when I get home from school, my senior year particularly, I only went to school 4 hours in the morning, 3 hours I think, in the morning. And when I'd come home, I'd always make sure that her floors were always mopped and waxed. So when my mother walked in, her house was always clean. And she'd usually get home about 5 o'clock in the evening, or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And when she'd walk in, her house would be clean from one end to the other. And I'd do that almost every other day. just to make sure that when my mom walked in, her house was clean. Now, it's not written anywhere that I had to do that. She never said, make sure by the time I get home this is done. It was done because I love my mom. And so because I love her, she didn't always have to ask or command or demand anything from me. Sometimes I just did it because I think my mom would like this, because I knew my mom. And I know my mother, she was one of those who believed that cleanliness was next to godliness. And that was her communication. That's how she thought of God. Clean must be of God. So one of the ways I could share my Christianity with her was to make sure that her house was always clean. No commandment anywhere. But see, knowing brings about obedience. And sometimes it's an unasked for obedience. Because the real process of obedience is love. The real relationship isn't that I obey God, it's that I love God. And sometimes love gets us to do things that we do without being asked. There are so many things my wife does for me that I couldn't begin to count all the things she does, and I don't even ask for them. I wouldn't know to ask for them half the time. But when I get done, get home, everything's always in order. This is done, this is done, this is done. There are just so many things she does for me every week. And there are things unasked for. There are things appreciated and I like them. But I never ask for them because she knows me and she loves me. So there are so many things that get done that are never asked for. See, that's the thing about it. Knowing brings obedience. We know it and others can see it. Others know my wife loves me because they can see the way she treats me. And hopefully, for example, our children know that mom loves dad, because who else would put up with dad? Except for mom, because she loves dad. And the kids know that dad loves mom because they can see the way I treat her. And people can know that we love Jesus because they see the way that we treat him. We don't follow the letter of the law. We don't only do what he says to do. We do things for him because we love him. We give him our life and our love because he's ours. And because we have learned him. We have learned him because we have loved him and lived with him, not just that we studied him. Obedience is a proof of love. Others see it. We know it and others see it by our obedience. And so we say that obedience is a proof of love. By this, we know that we are in him. By this, by what? By our love, by our obedient and our deeds of love that we do. That's how people know. That's how I know he's in me. Because why else would I do it if he weren't in here? Unbelievers do not serve God. Unbelievers are not thankful to God. I know he's in me because of the things I find myself doing for him. If he wasn't here, I wouldn't be talking to him in the middle of the night. I wouldn't be talking to him during the daytime. I'm not a loon. I don't go around talking to myself. But I am finding myself talking to Christ during the day, during the night. My children, Michael will often tell you stories about walking in and catching Dad talking to God. It wasn't that he caught his dad being a loon. Oh, Dad's over there talking to the clock. What's the clock saying today, Dad? It said, kill my kids. I don't talk to the clock, and the clock doesn't talk to me. If it did, you'd all be a little bit worried. You come in someday and I'm talking to that clock and it's telling me strange things, you're all going to leave. Because you know better. But my kids know that I have a relationship with God. They knew I had that relationship before they were ever born. And so the fact that Dad should talk to God, the God that he has known his whole life, isn't strange to them. They call it prayer. Oh, Dad's praying. Sometimes they hang around to see if God's answering. I hear that one in my heart. See, knowing brings obedience, and obedience is a proof of love. By this we know that we are in him. I have never questioned or doubted my salvation since the moment I got it. The fact that I felt led to pray and ask God to save me, and once I finished that prayer, to realize that I was really praying it. At first, I just started out following it when the preacher said to me, repeat after me. Hey, I did that, and that's how I ended up in the Navy. Say after me. You pledge. Yes. And the next thing you know, they said, okay, now you're in a 4-year contract and you can't get out. All because I raised my right hand and followed him. And the same thing was true when I came to Jesus Christ, and at first the preacher said to me, well, repeat these words. And at first I was repeating the words, but about halfway through it, the words became mine. And it was no longer just repeating him. I found that I was asking for it. In a very real way, I was asking for that salvation. I knew that I needed that salvation and that I had asked for it, and it was mine. And immediately I felt the impulse to follow and obey Jesus Christ. Immediately he became the most important person in my life, and I had to tell everyone I met about him. It was just that overwhelming to me. I couldn't believe that this truth was out there and hadn't been shared with me before, and I thought everybody wanted to know it. And so I told everybody about it, and I found out not everybody wanted to know. But I shared it with the folks. Why? Because, see, at some point in time, Jesus said, I am about my Father's business. Jesus said, it is my will to do the will of my Father who sent me. And if Jesus is in me and I am in Christ, at some point in time, his will is going to become my will. And if his will was to do the will of his Father who's in heaven, then at some point in time it becomes my will, my choice, my desire to do the will of my Father who's also in heaven. Because Christ is in me and I am in him. Just as he and the Father are one. He said, you and I will be one just as the Father and I are one. And so I have the same will. I find myself drawn toward the same things that Christ was drawn toward. Obedience is a proof of love. I know I love him because I find myself being obedient. I find myself when it wasn't easy to stand up and say that I belong to Jesus Christ. When it was tested, when it was tried, when sometimes people were pointing a gun at me and sometimes they weren't, I found it easy to claim him as mine. Obedience is a proof of love. You know the martyrs loved God because they were obedient even to death. Jesus Christ, we know he loved the Father because he was obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. I don't question the Son's obedience and love for the Father, not just his obedience, but that cross required love for his Father. Maybe more love for his Father than he had for me because he went to the cross. But he went to the cross not to satisfy me. He went to the cross to satisfy his Father. And so this was an act of love between him and his Father. I just get to receive that. But I know this much, he also loved me because he was willing to go there. And he went there for me. Took my place. And so this love proves salvation to me. I know that I am saved. I know that Christ is in me because it has radically changed my life. I am not the same man I was in the beginning. I don't do the same things. I don't even want the same things. Somebody once told me that when you get saved, your wanter is changed. That's what it's all about. And God changed the want in me so that I don't want my stuff. I'm not looking for riches. I'm not looking for fame. I'm not looking for any of that kind of stuff. I find myself, like Christ, drawn to the will of my Father who is in heaven. Why? Because knowing brings about obedience, and obedience is a guarantee or the demonstration of love. I know I love him. And sometimes, as I said earlier, loving somebody requires that we do sometimes more than they ask, more than they think. See, that's what we know about the Father. He does for us more than we ask or think, we're told in the Bible. Not because he wrote it down and said, I have to do this, I have to do this. As your father, I promise I will do this. I have no such contract. I had no such contract for my earthly father. My children have no such contract for me. I didn't promise to do anything for them. I'm just their dad. Now, my kids learned early on, particularly my son Luke, the last of them. We had often offered to give him a, what do they call that when parents give their children monies during the course of the week? An allowance. And I would say, I can give you an allowance. And Luke said, no, I don't want an allowance. No, I want to give you, no, Dad, I don't want your allowance. Why don't you want my allowance? Because if I get an allowance, that's how much I could spend. Not having an allowance, I get everything you got. See, he knows his dad. Hey, as my son, he is entitled to everything I have. If we limit ourselves to an allowance, if we make this a contract, I, your father, promise to give you X, I will live up to that contract, and he'll get $10 a week. But sometimes he needs 20. Sometimes he needs 25. But the contract only called for me to give you 10. See, he was smarter than the contract. He said, no, Dad, I'd rather have your love than your allowance. Because in my love, he gets everything that I have. And sometimes he'll call and he'll say, Dad, I need, buy it. And it's much more, I should have went with the allowance and kept that $10, right? See, that's the point. With Jesus Christ, he didn't put me on an allowance. You can get these many prayers answered in the course of the week. You're allowed to ask up to, and this much, and no more than that. But he never put me on an allowance. He loves me. Ask. And whatsoever you ask in my name, I will do it. Lord, I was trying to get a contract where you'd give me one prayer a week. That would be some sort of a contract. Jesus says, I ain't giving you one. See, he's smart like my son Luke. I'm not giving you a contract. I'm going to give you everything. What? I'm going to give you everything because of our relationship, because I'm your Lord and your God. I am your Savior. Because you love me and I love you, there's nothing you can't ask. You want your dad? I'll give him to you. It's going to take me a couple of years because I have to change your heart. I have to change your mama's heart. I have to change Charlie's heart. I have to change this heart and that heart. And I have to, there was a whole, you couldn't imagine all the things that God had to do and all the things God did to answer that one prayer. It revolutionized my mother when she was able to forgive my dad. But God had to get all that up and ready. And stuff that I didn't realize had to be done. See, knowing leads to doing. Doing leads to the evidence that love is there. There's no contradiction in our life. We're not perfect, and that's not what I'm stating here. I'm nowhere have I claimed perfection in my Christianity. Far from it. But if you were to look at me, you would have to say, well, he isn't perfect, but you could tell he loves the Lord. And you never see anything in my life that contradicts that. There are some men I know who their life is a constant contradiction. I don't see any of the things of God in them. I only see the world in them. And I'm drawn to the conclusion they don't know God. Based on this verse alone, I could say, I know they don't know him because I don't see them being obedient to him. I don't see them knowing him. Oh, they might recite 100 verses, but do they know him? The devil could recite this entire book backwards and forwards to you. And he could say, I know Jesus. Yeah, you know him from an outward experience, but you don't know him inside like I do. And so knowing leads to doing. So in our conclusion then, simply this 2 points. Knowing, it says, for we, or rather, he who says he abides in him ought himself also to walk even as he walked. To claim to be a Christian means you have to see Christ in me. And I draw this illustration knowing my parents made me mirror them. My mom would get mad at me because of my dad left when I'm 8 years old. And I came home one day, I'm in the United States Navy, I'm a grown man, 19 years old, and I walked in the room and my mom got mad at me because I startled her in her sleep and she started cursing out my dad. So I said, Mom, it's me. I had the same sailor hat that my dad wore when he was a young sailor. And boy, I thought she was going to kill me in the doorway. And then finally she woke up enough and she said, don't you ever walk in here looking like your dad again. See, I mirrored my dad because he was my dad. I didn't study my dad's habits. I didn't learn to walk like my dad. I didn't learn to tilt my hat like my dad. I didn't see any of those pictures of my dad. It's just I'm his son. And there are characteristics of my dad that are in me, and my mother didn't like them. And there are characteristics of Jesus in you and me that the world doesn't like. But we can't help it because we mirror and we reflect him. It's part of who our parent is. God is my Father. Therefore, I should reflect some of him. See, it wasn't like them because I studied my parents. I was like them rather because of my proximity to them. I was his son. How could I not be like him? My sons all inherit some of Dad. They all got traits that are from their mom can spot them. I can see things in them that remind us of their grandfather. Why? Not that they studied Grandpa, but you could see in them. I could see Grandma and Grandpa, both sets of grandma and grandparents in our children. And they don't even know my parents really. But I could see things of my dad in them, and things of my mom in them, and things of Grandpa and things of Grandma in them. Not that they studied them, but because of their proximity to them. Luke has a lot of thoughts that his grandma had because we lived with Grandma for a while. And he'll sit there and tell you, oh, Grandma and I used to talk about this and talk about that, and how much of his formulation came off of his grandma. See, now, you may have known Wanda Lou. Me, I know her as my tomato. Anybody who knew me and knew her knew that that was my tomato when she walked in the door. That's how well I knew her. I didn't call her. I know I was supposed to call her Mrs. Osborne. All the boys always referred to her as Mrs. Osborne. I never once, to my knowledge, ever called her Mrs. Osborne. I think when I walked in and she was curling her hair at her table, and I called her my little tomato, that was it. It's the only thing I ever called her. See, we aren't like people because we study them. We become like God because of our proximity to him. Because every day we spend time with the Father, and we spend time with the Son, we spend time with the Holy Spirit. And so we mirror them.